The land had forgotten what rain felt like. Once green fields now lay cracked and silent beneath a relentless sun. Rivers had shrunk into thin, lifeless streams, and the wind carried dust instead of life. People moved slowly, their strength drained, their hope fading with each passing day. In the midst of this suffering, Elijah stood apart, not because he was untouched by hardship, but because he carried a quiet certainty that even in the worst moments, provision would come. He was led away from the crowded places into solitude, to a hidden brook far from the noise and desperation of the people. There, surrounded by stillness, he drank from the flowing water and waited. Days passed, and something remarkable began to happen. Ravens, wild creatures of the sky, came to him. They brought bread and meat in their beaks, dropping it before him morning and evening. It was a strange and humbling sight, survival delivered by birds that owed him nothing. Elijah watched them closely, not just with wonder, but with understanding. Even here, in isolation, he was not forgotten. Eventually, the brook began to dry. The water that had sustained him grew weaker until it disappeared entirely. Once again, he was called to move forward. His journey led him to a small village, where life seemed just as fragile as the land itself. There, he encountered a widow gathering sticks. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as though every action cost her energy she could not spare. When Elijah spoke to her, he saw the weight she carried. She had only a handful of flour and a little oil left, barely enough for one final meal for herself and her son. After that, she expected nothing but the end. Yet Elijah asked her for food. It was not an easy request, and it seemed almost unreasonable. Still, something in his voice carried conviction. With hesitation, but also with a quiet spark of trust, she agreed. She prepared the meal as he had asked, using what little she had left. But when she returned to the jar, it was not empty. There was still flour, and the oil had not run out. Day after day, the same thing happened. Each time she reached for the jar, it provided just enough. It never overflowed, but it never failed. In a time defined by scarcity, her home became a place where need was quietly met. For a while, there was peace in that small house, but life is rarely without interruption. One day, her son became ill. What began as weakness turned into something far more serious. Soon, he stopped breathing altogether. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with grief and confusion. The widow's sorrow was deep. After everything she had endured, this loss felt unbearable. Elijah took the child and carried him to an upper room. There, he laid him down and prayed, not casually, but with urgency and intensity. It was a moment that demanded everything he had. Time seemed to stand still as he called out, refusing to accept the finality of what had happened. Then, slowly, life returned. The boy breathed again. What had been lost was restored, and the house that had been filled with mourning now overflowed with relief and gratitude. Beyond that small home, the wider nation struggled under leadership that had turned away from truth. The king, surrounded by influence and power, had led people into practices that brought confusion rather than clarity. Elijah knew he could not remain silent. He stood before the king without fear, speaking words that challenged not only authority, but an entire people. His boldness led to a defining moment. A challenge was set on a mountain, a place where truth would be revealed. Hundreds gathered, watching as both sides prepared to call upon their source of power. The air was tense, filled with anticipation. Elijah stood alone, facing many who claimed strength and authority. The hours passed without answer from the others. Their efforts brought no result. Then Elijah stepped forward. His actions were deliberate and calm. When he finally prayed, something extraordinary happened. Fire descended from the sky, consuming everything before it. It was sudden and undeniable. The crowd fell silent, overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. In that instant, uncertainty gave way to clarity. The false prophets lost their hold on the people. What had once seemed convincing was now exposed. It was a moment of awakening, a shift that changed everything. Yet even after such a powerful event, the land remained dry. Elijah returned to prayer, this time asking for rain. He knelt low, persistent, refusing to give up. Again and again he sent his servant to look toward the horizon. Each time there was nothing, until finally a small cloud appeared. It was barely noticeable, a tiny shape rising from the distance, but Elijah recognized its significance. What seemed small was the beginning of something greater. Soon the sky darkened, winds picked up, and rain began to fall. At first it was light, but it quickly grew into a heavy downpour. The earth absorbed it eagerly, and life began to return. But victory did not bring ease. A threat was made against Elijah, forcing him to flee into the wilderness. Fear drove him far from familiar places. He walked until he could go no further, eventually collapsing beneath a small tree. There, alone and exhausted, the weight of everything he had faced became too much. For the first time, he felt ready to give up. Yet even in that moment, he was not abandoned. He awoke to find food and water beside him. An angel had come, offering not only nourishment, but a reminder he was not finished. Strength returned slowly, enough to continue. He began a long journey toward a distant mountain. The path was difficult, stretching across rugged terrain. Each step required effort, but he pressed on. When he finally arrived, he sought refuge in a cave. There he witnessed powerful displays of nature. A fierce wind tore through the mountains. The ground shook with the force of an earthquake. Fire passed by, intense and consuming. Yet in all of this, there was no answer. Then came something unexpected, a gentle whisper. It was quiet, almost easy to miss, but in that stillness, Elijah found what he had been searching for. Not in the overwhelming, but in the subtle. Renewed, he returned to his mission. Along the way, he encountered a young man named Elisha. Without many words, Elijah placed his cloak over him, a simple gesture carrying deep meaning. It was an invitation, a calling. Elisha understood immediately. He left behind everything he knew and chose to follow him. Together, they traveled, their paths intertwined. There were moments of confrontation still ahead. When soldiers approached with arrogance, they were met with power that reminded them of their place. But when humility replaced pride, the outcome changed completely. It became clear that attitude mattered as much as action.
At the Jordan River, Elijah performed one final act. Striking the water with his cloak, he caused it to part. The river opened, revealing dry ground beneath. Together, he and Elisha crossed over. On the other side, something extraordinary happened. The sky seemed to open, and a chariot of fire appeared, carried by a whirlwind. In a moment that defied understanding, Elijah was taken up, leaving the earth behind. Elisha watched, unable to look away. It was a moment filled with awe, one that would shape everything that followed. As Elijah disappeared, his cloak fell back down. Elisha picked it up, holding not just a garment, but a symbol of what had been passed on. When he returned to the river and struck it, the waters parted once more. The journey continued, but now it was his to carry forward. Elijah's life had been marked by moments of power and quiet faith alike. Behind every visible act was a deeper connection built through prayer. He had walked through seasons of loneliness, stood against opposition, and faced moments of doubt. Yet he continued. His influence extended beyond his own lifetime. Through those he taught and inspired, his legacy lived on. What he had started did not end with him, it grew. In the end, Elijah became more than a figure in history. He became a reminder that strength is not always loud, that provision can come in unexpected ways, and that even in the most difficult times, there is a path forward. And so his story remains, not just as a record of what was, but as a reflection of what can be when faith endures.